Now, we're up to Ezekiel chapter 34. We're looking at 4 chapters. And really, one of the things I want you guys to think about is sheep tonight. Not the fact that New Zealand has got so many sheep that there's more sheep than people. But in fact, Australia has more sheep than New Zealand. No one ever points that out. Not about that. But when we think of a shepherd and we think of sheep, we have a completely different picture in mind to what the 5th, 6th, 7th century BC had in mind, let alone the 10th century BC. One of the most common, beloved songs to have at a funeral is "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Psalm 23, written by David, who, if you may remember, was a shepherd. David, in his early life, was a shepherd, and so he actually knew exactly what shepherds do. He knew what it was like to stand in front of the lion, or the wolf, or the bear. Seriously, he uses those words, and to defend your sheep against the wild animals. So that's really, really a very wonderful psalm. And the shepherd that is in mind in Psalm 23 is a completely different shepherd to the one that's in mind in Ezekiel 34. In Ezekiel 34, the shepherd is actually a lot closer to the modern Australian shepherd than to the 1000 BC shepherd. See, if we think of shepherds and sheep, we think of a big sheep station, 20,000 sheep, 30,000 sheep, 100,000 sheep, spread out over hundreds, thousands of hectares, massive tracts of land, huge area. And so the shepherd, the sheep farmer, will go out on his motorbike with his dog and ride out, move the sheep from one paddock to the other. They've got nice fences, so you don't have to worry about them wandering off the side of a cliff. And so you have that. That's our picture. When David wrote his psalm, when Ezekiel said these things, when Jesus spoke in the 1st century, shepherds, well, they didn't have fences. You weren't allowed to put up a fence, and things like wire didn't really exist back then. So you couldn't have a shepherd saying, "I will leave my sheep in the paddock and they'll still be there tomorrow." No. You had to fence them in. You had to go and have a wooden pen that you would put them in overnight. And you would stay with them because someone else could just walk in and try to drag them off. Wild animals could come. So the job of a shepherd was to be with the sheep. So when God says, "Woe to the shepherds of my people. Woe to the shepherds of my people, because they have been not shepherds. They have been consumers. They have not fed my sheep. They have eaten my sheep. They have not bound up the sick and the wounded and sought out the lost and gone and looked for them. They have said, we've got plenty. There's still more to eat here." They take the wool, they're allowed to do that. They take the curds, they're allowed to do that. I know we don't think about it, sheep milk. They do all of that stuff, they're allowed to do that, but then they kill the fatted ones and they eat them. And God says, "No, they're not your sheep. They are my sheep. My people Israel." Now, if you've been paying attention to Ezekiel 1 to 33, if you haven't been here, I'm about to summarise it so you haven't missed anything. Ezekiel 1 to 33 is largely Israel. Oi, wake up. Come on. Stop sinning. Stop sinning. oh man, you're in trouble. You are so in trouble. That's Ezekiel 1:33. And God brings judgment. I know, we've done it for 5 weeks. I could have just said that. It's more interesting than the first one. God brings judgment on Israel because as God's people, they have neglected God. They have worshipped other gods. They have brought idols into the temple. We never get that. But they have brought idols of other gods into the temple of the God without shape. And so God says, that's it. I'm going to punish you, and it's going to be bad. You're not going to like it. It's going to be really, really bad. Other nations around the world will go, how on earth did that happen? That's terrible. What did these people do that their God would punish them so strictly? And then we get to chapter 34. Chapter 34 is a turning point in Ezekiel. It's critical. Because up until now, God has been, I am against my people. My people have sinned. I am against my people. And now God drills down and he says, I am against the leaders of my people. I am against the ones who should have known better. I am against the educated. I am against the rich. They knew what they were supposed to do, and they didn't do it. And they knew what they were not supposed to do, and they did it. They didn't look after my people. They treated them as food. They've sucked money out of widows and orphans and abandoned them. They've used the worship of me as a means of financial gain. And God's angry with the people, but he's very angry with the leaders. And what God says, aside from phones on silent, what God says is that if you had led where you were supposed to go, my people would have gone there. If you had done what you were supposed to do, well, maybe they would not have gone so far off track. And God says to the leaders, you're out of here. You can't do the job. I will do the job. Okay. Trolls, stop texting and ringing people who are here. I'm just going to make sure my phone's on silent quickly. And everyone else, phone's on silent. God says, I will be the shepherd of my people. I will seek out the lost and the scattered and the hungry and the sick and the lame, and I will tend to them. And then we come into Ezekiel chapter 35. You'll see it's titled A Prophecy Against Edom. It's interesting, it starts out that God speaks to the Mount Seir. That is simply a representative place of the Edomites. And God says, yo, Edom, that is the cousins of the Israelites. If you remember Genesis 25 to 36, Esau and Jacob, right? Esau was the older brother, the older twin, and his descendants were called the Edomites. And Jacob was the younger twin, his descendants were called the Israelites. His name got changed to Israel. It's a trick question there. Okay? And God says, you should have looked after your cousins. Instead, you rejoiced when they fell. So I'm going to punish you for that. You held on to an ancient enmity, and that's where you came undone. And then that brings us to chapter 36. In chapter 36, God speaks again to the mountains, but this time to the mountains of Israel. And he says, I'm going to restore you. I'm going to restore your fortunes. No one's ever going to say, the mountains of Israel have devoured the people. And you get this little play. You've got the 35ers talking to the Mount Seir, and he judges that. And then he turns to chapter 36 and says to the mountains of Israel, I'm going to look after you. I'm going to restore you. It could even be, hinting back in Deuteronomy. You've got the blessings from one mountain and the curses from another. And, that's late in Deuteronomy. There's this whole mountain thing with the idea that the mountains look down on and observe what is going on. And so the mountains of Israel have observed the sin of Israel and the punishment of Israel. And the nations just wiping them out. And God says, relax. The first 7 verses are to placate the mountains of Israel, to say, this is how I'm going to treat the nations. The ones that have been really getting down on Israel and doing all this destruction and saying all these things. And then in verses 8 to 12, God says He's going to fill the mountains with food, people and animals. The mountains that were what deprived the Israelites because of wild people, wild animals, now they're safe. Now the mountains are safe. Verses 16 to 21 show us why God acted the way He did because of the sin of the Israelites. And verses 22 and 23 show us that it's still nothing that the people have done that makes God save them, but the concern that He has for His name. Now, can anyone tell me what is wrong with this picture? God has chosen His people. They have acted wickedly against Him, and in His words, profaned His name among the nations. When God rescues His people, what problem do they have? What problem do they still have? Do you guys need to stand up, turn around and wake up? Is their behaviour going to change? No. They're going to keep sinning. Nothing is different. They'll continue in their sin and rebellion. How precisely will God not only deal with their sin, but also stop them from sinning more? How will, in God's words in verse 23, show Himself holy through Israel before the eyes of the nations? How will God stop His name from being profaned again and again in the lives of His people? How will He stop His holy name from being profaned by the people in the 21st century? And here's the clincher. This is what I'm about to say is new. Okay? It's new for the people of Israel. 600 years before Jesus, they'd never even considered it. It wasn't even on the radar. God says, I'm going to bring you back from the nations, verse 24. I will clean you from your sin, verse 25. And in verses 26 and 27, God will give them a new heart. And He will put His Spirit in them and give them new life. Now, that's revolutionary. That's amazing. The only people who got the Spirit of God living in them were the prophets and the kings. You might remember David says, Psalm 53, Lord, he's repenting, and he says, take not your Holy Spirit from me. Because it happened to Saul. Saul was given the Holy Spirit of God, and then because he continued to sin, God took His Holy Spirit away from him, and then He gave it to David. And so, if you are a person living in a time of the exile, and you're thinking about the Spirit of God, it's like one person gets it. And God says, I'm going to put my Spirit in all of my people. All of my people. It's unbelievable. And so that answers the question, how will God's people not profane His holy name? How will we not profane His name? Because His Spirit will live in us. And what does that look like? Chapter 37, come there with me.